co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about lesson 15 of our study, which covers the book of Exodus, chapter 18. We have now successfully crossed the Red Sea. We have begun to form what is the identity of these people. Right? They were slaves, now they're not. They did have other people telling them what and how to do. Now they sort of don't, except possibly Moses. But they're not super keen on that authority either. So very much we're still in a transition period. We're also in a transition period for Moses. Most of the second half of the study is going to address the growth arc or lack thereof of the people. Moses was mostly in the first half. This lesson, however, and this section of the book of Exodus provides a little bit more insight into Moses' arc and development because of its bearing on the people. Moses has been trying to outwork some of the issues of these people, right? They don't know how to solve anything for themselves, need a lot of hand-holding. And Moses has been trying to single-handedly deal with all of that, which is not sustainable. But, you know, it's very easy when you're in a situation and it just sort of slowly and gradually starts getting out of hand to not really catch that. Or to feel obliged and like you have to be doing what you're doing. Then, very fortunately for Moses, his father-in-law finds him with his wife and children, and they have a very helpful talk where Jethro basically says, "Hey Moses, that this is a bad idea, and we need to, you need to figure out a way to delegate some of this stuff." The fascinating thing for the people, so Moses has been like, every time there's a dispute or anything that needs to be settled between people, as we learn, Moses has been doing it. When he needs to delegate the ability to make those decisions and decide between people, that also gives rise to the need for them to have a set of regulations or rules that they can use to consistently make those decisions, if it's not just Moses. So what we're describing here is the immediate situation that begets the need for law. The interesting thing, so the way our country is built, you have law and you have judges that serve the law. And we conceptualize it that way. And it becomes that way for these people, but it starts in the flipped order. You have judges, and the law serves and helps inform the decisions made by the judges, not the judges serve and uphold the law. The law is seen as a tool to be used by the people who are judging, and the judging is the thing that is of higher and greater importance. And Moses has been serving as that sole judge. Judges is a thing starting here that maintains importance for a long time through the narrative beyond the Torah, right? As we leave these first 5 books of the Bible and transition into the time of the Holy Land, we have Joshua immediately picking up kind of the mantle of Moses, but doing so differently. And as we continue to have a leader of these people, that person has authority as a judge of the people. It's not hereditary. It seems to be assigned by God or the previous judge, and it becomes kind of the status quo here for a while for these people. And it's useful so for us, it's hard to conceptualize why is a judge an important thing, right? Because again, we have a law, and you can appoint like judges almost interchangeably in service of the law, assuming they're, acting in good faith as judges. And so, kind of a little bit, who cares? It's a neat thing, and obviously judges have to be knowledgeable and well-informed, and they uphold and enforce our laws, and they're essential to our legal system, but they are servants of our legal system. Here, the model is the legal system is in service of the judges who are kind of overseeing the people. I think it's important to understand that it's conceptually flipped, mostly as you get into the idea of the judges. Because for me at least, there's always been the question of how can these judges be in a position of authority or power, right? Judges don't have that kind of, in our system by design, don't have that kind of executive authority, right? We split legislative and executive and judicial authorities because that can lead to problems. But these judges are they have legislative and executive and judicial authority, starting with Moses and continuing for a while. It's only later that we see those things start to diverge. So here we get the beginning of this. We have Moses as a judge, and he needs to delegate and pass along some of that judicial authority. And to do so, he needs a law to act in service of those other people trying to help pass some more minor judgments. We don't get the law in this section, but it gives immediate rise to the need for a law. And again, conceptually, we see the expansion of the role of judge before we see the institution of the law, and not as we would tend to think of it the other way around. For the book of Exodus, we won't dwell too much on that distinction. It becomes a lot more important when you get into judges who aren't Moses, because by his unique nature, Moses is a lot of things together that don't find themselves all together again until Jesus. So Moses is a special case, but here it is fascinating to see both the effect of outside counsel for Moses, especially somebody who's not even an Israelite, and kind of the case that creates the need for law as we're moving toward a people who are legalistic. It begins a long, long journey for these people, up to and leading to, by the time we get to Jesus, we see the religious leaders very much do treat the law as primary, right? The Pharisees, for sure, by the time you come back from exile and you have a legal class of scribes that eventually also give birth to the Pharisees, the law is at that point primary, and the administrators are in service of the law. But for a long time before we get to that, the law is in service of the administrators. And it's interesting to see how that works and why it flips, because it definitely doesn't work that well. But here we are now, and we're laying some really interesting foundation for things that will be in place for a long time. Here we see the return of Moses' father-in-law, someone we saw after Moses left Egypt originally, and that we left behind when Moses returned. At that point, along with Moses' wife and children. But we're starting with Moses' father-in-law, here named Jethro, the priest of Midian. Little bit by way of background, the written lesson has more of this, and it's interesting. The line that leads to Jethro is branched off from Abraham. So he would have had some familiarity by family lineage with the God of Abraham, but not with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and is not in the line of Israel. And so developments that come, through the line of Israel would have missed him. And he was not born of Sarah. And there was, it took a while for them to get over, get to the one God point. And if they didn't stay on that main pathway in line, and they didn't continue to have the patriarchs keeping everything straight and in line, they recognized God, but they didn't recognize God as the only God, which makes Moses' relationship with his father-in-law interesting, to say the least, because they do both recognize the God who has been the God of Abraham is the part of that they have in common. But Midian also recognizes many other things that are not that God, many other fake gods. So they seem to get along very well, though. And so Jethro hears through news about, I mean, it's really big news, right? All the slaves left Egypt, and the Egyptians tried to chase them and were just completely crushed. And, you know, God was probably involved, which is, I suspect, a thing the Egyptians would be more than happy to propagate, because they don't want to allow that they just lost in a military encounter to all of their slaves, basically unarmed and untrained. It's probably better PR for everyone involved if God did that, including the Egyptians. So word gets to Jethro that this happened, and he thinks, oh, Moses went to do something about that. I should go see what my son-in-law is up to. This sounds like a big deal that this thing happened. And Jethro, being a man who is the priest of Midian, suggesting he's in an interesting parallel role to Moses, where he's seen as not a point of contact between some people and their God, but potentially as the one, which maybe gives us some insight into why God might have had Moses go spend some time with Jethro before returning back to the people, where Moses was going to do likewise. Moses could have learned a lot from living with his father-in-law that he is now making use of. And considering Moses didn't know his own father and could have had a complicated situation in his upbringing, he could very well identify Jethro as a father figure as well. So this is an interesting time and situation for Jethro to be returning, and it seems to, from Jethro's point of view, be genuinely motivated by the idea that, you know, I'm in the business of gods and God things, and this seems like the biggest news in my line of work to happen in a very long time, and I think my son-in-law might be involved deeply in what's going on. I'm going to go see what's up with Moses and what's going on here, because this sounds like a thing that I should be engaging with, which, good for him. He's acting in good faith, right? In contrast to the Egyptians, and so far, almost all the Israelites, who are none of them acting in good faith. But Jethro here is, if that happened at all, then I need to figure out what's going on with this God thing. And I need to figure out if that happened. So I'm going to go look into it. Here we catch up on another thing that happened. When Moses left for Egypt, he left his wife and his children behind, and they went to live with Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. So we're introduced back to Zipporah, and we're naming Moses' children, Gershom and Eleazar. I have been a sojourner in a foreign land, and the God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. The names people gave to their children used to be far more significant to things going on in their lives in a lot of cases than we bother with now. Mostly a cultural difference. It's not necessarily a bad thing that we don't do that now. The interesting thing here is not the names of Moses' children, but the fact that those names don't matter after this. We've been through and will continue going through a lot of lineages in the Bible. And they're usually important The important part about Moses' lineage is how unimportant it is. Because we've had Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and the major figures that we've had before now have been in a line, and that line and heritage has mattered greatly. And now we have Moses, and that line doesn't matter at all. And that's a very big deal for what's changing. We've moved away, and will stay away until David, from having, in the executive branch at least of these people, from having birth be a contributing factor. Moses was called by God to serve in the role that he's serving for these people. And when he's done, God will call someone else to follow after him. Joshua, who is not related to Moses. And when Joshua is done and the people start to go astray, God will call another judge as well, and another one, and another one. And it will be by call until we have kings. And we do that because the people asked for it. And that doesn't go any better. And then we get to Jesus, who is king by birth, but also called by God, and anointed. And it's a big deal that he is. But for what God is intending to do with how he runs these people, now that we have this people with a common ancestor and heritage, and they are the people of Israel, we're done with that genetic thing in the executive branch. We are going to keep that, and it's going to matter, as we'll see, in the priesthood. But the priesthood doesn't descend from Moses either. And if it did, it would risk conflating the priesthood with that executive authority, which God doesn't want to do. So since Moses is in charge, God doesn't make Moses the priest, because he doesn't want this idea that it's the same thing. So he has a relation of Moses as the priest, and Moses is otherwise separate. An interesting thing happened with Moses' call to go speak to Pharaoh, where God had in mind, Moses, you should do all these things. And Moses said, I'm not doing those parts of that. And then God said, well, I guess, you have that brother. I guess he could do it. But you have to be in charge. And that moved us from the one to the two. And the two are not equal in authority or in devotion to God, right? Like God picked the right one, and the one that got involved because Moses would work with them, less helpful, as we'll see. So far, Aaron's been fine, but he's going to be less fine. It's interesting to think about. So it works out okay that the priesthood and the executive authority are separate, and the priesthood ends up becoming genetic through Aaron. But that from the beginning is kind of deeply flawed. And what would have happened if instead it had all rested with Moses, who kind of turned away from part of that? This is not a slight on Moses, by the way, right? He did what he felt like he was able to do, and God filled in the rest. Moses wasn't able to be all of those things. Somebody else is, right? This is like these great big figures like Moses and David, and especially those two, and Elijah. And Samuel, and some others to varying degrees, all are able to do much, but not all of the things God is asking one person to do. And for it to work really well, it needs to be one. And where we see problems arise are when it diverges and it's not. That's not a thing a human can solve, but it's interesting to think about. Because Jesus brings all those branching paths back into one thing and shows what was intended all along. So Moses' children don't matter. Aaron's do because of reasons that we'll talk about, and that branching off of the priesthood from what Moses is doing. But for the parts of the role that Moses keeps, his children don't matter. And that stays true for every prophet. Prophet is never an office that's inherited because it requires, you can't inherit a relationship with God, right? Or that kind of call from God. God chooses whoever he wants to do that, and it's by circumstance and many, many things. That is, even when the executive branch again becomes inherited and the priesthood is, prophets never are. Prophets are always called by God. And Moses is first and foremost a prophet. So his line doesn't matter. Moses matters. But I'm sure that different culture back then, but it is also interesting that in going to serve God, he ended up like so all in that he left his wife and his children behind. And I'm sure that he's glad that they're there again. That's not a side of Moses' willingness to follow and to do what God wanted that we talk about a lot, but that would have been quite a sacrifice on his part to do that. And we just kind of brush over, oh man, Moses, well, Pharaoh, let my people go. And the implication of them going is he's going to leave and never see his family again. And he's still all in on, I need to, help the people of Israel and do what God told me to do. This is a nice thing for Moses that Jethro gets moved to come and see what's going on and decides to bring Moses' family with him. It's not a thing that Moses would have been counting on happening at all. So this is, in a way, God seeing to, okay, Moses, you're doing, what I asked you to do, kind of unreserved. This is not unlike Abraham finally having the son that he wanted after all the years following and serving God. God provides, he knows the things we want as well as the things we need. And if we're steadfastly working and serving God, he's going to see to those things as well. But if how we serve him places conditions around those things, then it creates a barrier between us and God, right? So the thing we're called to do is, like Moses and Abraham, be unreservedly all in, and God, I'll give up everything and I will serve and follow you. And then what you do with that and how you take care of me, that's up to you. If you create, and not all of you necessarily, I do this too often, and I think it's one of the things that stands in the way of relationship with God, is when you create conditions or barriers in the way of, God, I will serve you this far, but not this far, or that far, but not that far. An area of reflection for any of us for growth is, where are our lines, right? Not saying you have to I have to be willing to give up my wife for God, so if I'm going to serve God, I need to give up my wife now, right? No. He may very well want you to serve him in the circumstances you're already in your life. But if those things become a detriment to your service of God, any of them, are you willing to leave them? And there are obviously covenantal marriage relationship, right? Not necessarily that's not a thing you just divorce and separate. Also not a thing I'm saying, but a separation might be necessary in some cases if that's, there are an easier example than the one here with Moses is, for example, a job. I had a job in what was, in theory, a Catholic serving religious organization that underwent some changes in leadership, and through I think the people in charge of and like on the board of the organization didn't understand that this guy that they hired was faking his relationship with God and really didn't have any, and was treating his staff in ways and asking things of them that I felt were contradictory to my faith. And it was actually in a Bible study that a thing occurred to me that just sort of clicked, and I can't do this anymore. This isn't right. And I quit shortly thereafter, with no clear idea of what was next. That would be harder for me to do now than it was then. Thankfully, I don't feel that I need to right now, but there very well may be times in our lives where we are called to change things that we're comfortable with on the basis of, or better yet, behaviors, right? Like, God, I'll serve you this far, but don't ask me to give up watching TV all Sunday to spend some time with you doing something else, or I'll go this far, but again, not that far, right? Moses, Abraham, these big figure, Jesus, the big figures in the Bible who are doing well show us that involves having nothing that we would put in that place and between us and God. So the biggest takeaway from a personal point of view from this lesson is, look what Moses was willing to do. What in my life would I not give up for God? And there is a thing that we can all stand to work on. So we see that Moses is reunited with his father-in-law. And we also see these guys have a very good relationship, right? Jethro isn't, hey, I brought your family to you that you left behind, you jerk. And you can imagine scenarios where this is like hostile, right? And that's not what it is at all, which is important to understand, right? They're glad to see one another. And Jethro also being a representative between God and people, seems to understand, uniquely so, the burden Moses is facing and the decision that he made, especially after the fact with what's happened. Jethro clearly has the idea that, that's the thing that needed to happen. And let's talk about it. And here, this is not only a meeting of family, but in some way a meeting of colleagues. They're in the same line of work, and Jethro has been doing it much longer than Moses has. So this is a fortuitous meeting, or even God ordained, because Jethro is a priest of that same God. God very well may have given him a little push to go check on Moses as well. So in this meeting, Jethro comes, and getting caught up to speed, Jethro comes away with a few clear conclusions. This is clearly the work of God. You say it's the work of this God. None of the other gods that I know could do this. I'm in the mediation between God and people business, and have been a long time, and none of the others could do this. This is unprecedented. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. Big deal, right? So Jethro now has a decision to make in his own life, right? Similar to the one Moses made when he encountered the burning bush and had a similar realization that I need to take this seriously. And I guess I'm all in. it seems like Jethro is reacting similarly to how Moses did. Okay, I'm in. How can I help? Which is, these guys actually have a lot in common, right? Which reinforces the idea that Jethro was probably like a father figure to Moses. When presented with the call, they both respond in a similar way and are willing to recognize, accept, and act on the reality of who God is. It also places Jethro, not an Israelite, in an interesting contrast to all of these Israelites. Jethro has only heard about what God did. All of these Israelites lived it. Jethro is all in. All these Israelites are grumbling and complaining. Jethro is the better role model than all the people who are by descendant Israelites and the chosen people of God. Again, reinforcing how are we responding, right? How do we respond when we see God working in our lives elsewhere? Do we say, oh, that's nice for them, or keep it a little bit away from me, I'm a little uncomfortable with that much God intervening, or praise God, that's amazing, and use it as an opportunity to grow in our own relationship with God, right? There are these signs and stories and countless evidence of the working of God in the world, and there's also stuff going around that looks like that's probably some hooey. So still have to be discerning when those things arise, but we've definitely all known people who have stories and have witnessed things ourselves that this is God working, right? And it is, maybe I'm more jaded than most of you, and that would be wonderful for most of you. My first reaction to a lot of these things is not glory be to God. My first reaction is more commonly to be, that's good for you, I guess. Is that a real thing? Which is probably too cynical. Which is too cynical. Jethro is a great model of, I heard that God might be doing something here and I want to know what that is. Now that I'm knowing what that is, wow, God is great. I'm all in. And he uses it to reinforce, to augment his own faith. He wasn't delivered from slavery to the Egyptians. That whole event didn't affect his life in any way directly, but that it happened fundamentally changed his relationship with God. Are we open enough that the same can be true? That God's intervention with something that doesn't affect me directly can nonetheless substantively improve my relationship with God. If I'm being honest with myself, I'm too cynical for that most of, if not all of the time. And the answer for me personally is no, probably. But I don't think that's a correct attitude. As I'm reflecting right now, as we're going through this, Jethro is a good model in many ways and causes us, again, some interesting self-reflection. And then a very interesting thing happens. We know that there was the idea of animal sacrifice in service of God among these people, because that was their cited reason for going out into the wilderness and leaving Egypt. So we know it wasn't a foreign concept to them. They did go out into the wilderness, like they said they wanted to offer sacrifice. We have not seen them do so. In the book of Exodus, we have not seen anyone who is an Israelite offer sacrifice to the Lord. We still haven't. what we have seen is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, offers as priest, offer sacrifices to God. We don't have any priests of God yet. We have, except Jethro, who is, by virtue of his relationship to Abraham, a priest to God among others. And so Jethro shows up, and suddenly we are doing priestly things because we have a priest. And Aaron joins in the meal. So that's important, because who is going to be our priest? And where did he learn it from? It seems that we learn how to be priests of God from Jethro, who is not an Israelite, but is a priest, the priest of Midian. What a fascinating thing that the priesthood to God, this hereditary and incredibly important thing, Moses, of course, consults with God and they refine the practice a little bit. But what happens and how this goes starts from dinner with Moses, Jethro, and Aaron after Jethro reinitiates priestly service of God. After Jethro hears what's happened and says, "This is it, and I'm a priest. I'm gonna priest now. I'm gonna do priest things now to this God because he's commissioned for it." But we surely don't think about the foundations of the Old Testament practice of priesthood deriving from someone who's not an Israelite. And it's so cool that happens, and that it's because of Moses' time away from his people and the Egyptians. Moses has 3 heritages, not 2. He has his heritage as an Israelite, his heritage in the Egyptian palace, and his time with his father-in-law and his family. And of the 3 of those, that one ends up being vocationally the most important, and the Israelite one, of course, also mattering because he's that, but he's one of the people. And the whole growing up in the palace thing becomes the least important part of all of it. Because the time with Jethro and his family is glossed over so much and gets so little airtime in Exodus, we tend to, I think, undersell how important that is. But here, just in this one verse, a terribly important thing happens that we'll probably comment more on as we go through how this priesthood develops. But also, Jethro, like the other priest of God that we've seen before him, it doesn't matter. His lineage doesn't matter, right? We've had Melchizedek before him, and now we have Jethro, it matters that Jethro came from Abraham and is in that line. But his dad doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that Moses is his son-in-law. That whole line after him, he's just a priest who shows up like Melchizedek, who happens to have some relationship with God, like Melchizedek, comes in, says, "Hey, here all is how you do priest things," and then sort of fades away while they start trying to learn to do it themselves. It is possible to be a priest of God without being of the line of Aaron, which matters so much when we get to Jesus, because he's not. And he is very much a priest. He is the priest of God. So anyway, very interesting thing happening here in one verse. So now that Jethro is here, and spending some time with his son-in-law, he sees the routine that Moses is settled into, which is an understandable one, how it would have developed. But the outside counsel is going to be helpful. Moses being the representative of God and the one who can get God's opinion on things directly. What started as big decisions, right? Moses, what does God want us to do about, like, what direction does he want us to march today, right? Things that clearly need a single point of view and it needs to come from God. Quickly turned into also, Moses, does God think my neighbor is wrong to set up his tent this close to mine? And does God think this or that? You know how petty people can be as well as I do, right? And so the big deal things and the not big deal things are all coming to Moses. And so what has happened is there are so many people that Moses' entire day is just a mob of people surrounding him to ask him God's opinion about everything that's on their minds. And that's Moses' daily routine, is get up, go grab some manna or eat some that somebody brought for you, get mobbed by people, evening time, get some quail that fell from the sky, mobbed by more people, time to go to bed. This is a thing I think of, personally I think of this, in my current job was the only one who did it. And then we're building a team that now has 6 other people in addition to me and will continue to grow. So in the early days, I made all of the decisions and set all of the policy. And as we added people and we've tried to scale, even with 6 people, it became a significant, and sometimes still does, a significant problem that I have to make too many decisions of things that I shouldn't need to make. And so we've had to do what they're going to do here and create rules and policies and delegate the easier ones, or I would never stop just answering questions about what do I do in this situation? What do I do in that situation? What do I do in that situation? And it's with fewer and fewer, it's with not that many people. But it's a thing, as you're discovering and learning how to do a thing, you can really use the vision and the voice of one person directing it. But to scale and to keep from overwhelming that person at the top, you have to start creating tools to enable other people to make their own decisions. But here Moses is, what Jethro is seeing is Moses hasn't done that. He's just let it continue to, and he's felt probably like he had to because, well, we've seen these people. And so he may not have thought he had a lot of options and thought they need someone to constantly babysit them. But in so doing, he has taken an enormous load upon himself that Jethro is now witnessing from the outside. Seeing what Moses is doing, Jethro, and this is where it's so important that this is an outside person who's not one of the people, Israelites, and following Moses, right? Because none of them is going to be willing to say this to Moses. But Jethro one day sees it and says, Moses, what you're doing is not good. Can you imagine like Aaron trying to say that to Moses? And then Moses could say, well, God talks to one of us and it's not you. So I think I'm good as I am. Or like some random other Israelite, Moses, I don't think it's good that you're spending all day answering these people's questions. The dynamic is just such that doesn't work. But one day, and based with Jethro there, and based on their relationship and the fact that they're in the same line of work, Jethro can say, "Hey Moses, like no, that doesn't work. It's too much for you. You can't do it. I'm just offer some counsel, and God be with you, and you're the one who has this relationship with God, so evaluate it as you wish. But from my point of view, someone else in the trade, this isn't how this needs to go. You can't do it." And again, fascinating to think. I don't think Moses could have taken this counsel from any of the other Israelites if they'd have even been willing to give it. We know Moses is an example of humility, so unlike me, I don't know that his pride would have gotten in the way, but I can't imagine any of them even bringing it up. Without Jethro coming, I think that might have continued, and the people very well may have crushed Moses. They almost do anyway, as we'll see. So here, for a second time, Jethro, the priest of Midian, offers a suggestion that shapes the whole way that all of these people will operate in the future, which is, Moses, you need to delegate, and you need rules for the people you delegate to follow. So you're going to find trustworthy people, and you're going to build a bureaucracy or a chain of command, where you have some people over small groups and, escalating up, and you're going to be at the very top, and you're going to teach them how to make decisions give them rules and policies to follow so that they can make decisions that are in line with the will of God. And so that you're not telling every individual group of people the same things over and over and over and over again. You're enabling these other people to know that without talking to you, so that only the big deal things get brought to your attention. And that, it doesn't get talked about a lot in the Bible from here on out, but some. It'll come around some, that we have these sort of lieutenants of whoever is in charge. But this is a thing that happens for a long time. Just from, Jethro's been here 2 days at this point, and he has said, Aaron, join me while we offer sacrifice to God, and then we'll have dinner and talk. And Moses, you're not going to do that way. It's not sustainable. Here, do this. And you're going to need to, write some rules. We're going to need to write some rules down for these people for that to happen. So you're going to need a written law. The influence of this guy is impossible to overstate. This priesthood, written laws, and judges to enforce them, that's like the whole identity of these people until David. That Jethro the non-Israelite, laid out for Moses in 2 days. Impossible to overstate the emphasis, and Moses gets credit for all of these things, right? Because, he does them. He deserves credit for them as well. But it's fascinating to think that they came from, I have previously found myself thinking, when I wasn't as familiar with Exodus, Moses growing up in the palace must have gotten this idea of law. And it must be that part of his background and no, not at all. He didn't learn administration from there. He learned it from his father-in-law. And then it was reinforced at a key point in his life. Interesting thing to think about. But Jethro brings up a good point, and we'll see that Moses is open to that suggestion. Here's another interesting one. If you do this, and God so commands you, not I, Jethro, right? Whether it's his priest or prophet, his role as intermediary between God and Jethro, or God and the people, Jethro is doing a thing that only Moses is otherwise qualified to do. He is speaking with the voice of God to Moses and saying, not only am I telling you this, but God is telling you to do this. And in every other instance where God is telling Moses to do something, God tells Moses to do it. Here, God is telling Jethro to tell Moses to do it. Then you will be able to endure, and all this people will go to their place in peace. He's half right. Moses will be able to endure. The people going to their place in it is relative peace. Like the general structure and day-to-day operation of the people and the ability to, corral them and move them all together in a common direction does improve from here. It makes a big difference. It is not enough for such stubborn people, as we will see, but it is a huge positive step. And again, it's interesting to see the large impact Jethro has in a very short time. So Moses listens to his father-in-law, does what he says, sets up the chain of command, and Jethro leaves. Less than a chapter, or basically a chapter, here we have Jethro. And in that brief bit of time, so much changes for what these people are going to do. This is a fascinating chapter thrown here in at the turning point of these people of Israel. From a character who was previously mentioned and not even with a consistent name, and barely as a throwaway just because he happens to be, the father of Moses' wife before. And now he makes a reappearance in a single chapter, and what a big deal that makes. So where we're at now, then, as we conclude, is we've teased an idea of reinstituting priestly practice. We've set up some judges who are going to judge and need a thing to judge accordingly, or according to a law of sorts, or just a law. So here we set kind of our agenda for the next bit of this book is we need to figure out and firm up doing these things that Jethro has inspired and how we're going to do them as the people of God. So Jethro didn't tell you what rules to use to judge. He just suggested you should have some. And he didn't tell you how to be priests of just the one God. He just was priest as he knows how and kind of reminded you that you ought to be priesting. And so law and priesthood, which remain very intermingled concepts, are not inherently joined, right? They come about at the same time, and they're both important to the identity of this people. And Moses is going to implement both of them. But judges need the law. Priests don't. By Jesus' day, that line blurs further, and they've joined inseparably back together. But for the Old Testament history up until the exile, the two do not need to overlap, which is probably a part of the problem with the priesthood. Is that they have no direct dependence upon the law for the operation of the priesthood. Serving God was on paper, as long as they're faithful priests of God, it shouldn't matter, right? And here, to Moses and to Jethro, it's not occurring to them that the priesthood needs a structure of adherence to the law, because to them, they can't fathom the idea that a priest wouldn't be a faithful servant of God. And if everybody's serving God, then the priests, in theory, are above the law insofar as they are serving God. And the law is for the people who don't have the relationship that the priests have. On paper, that works. Aaron is going to demonstrate before terribly long why that might be problematic in an exchange that involves priesthood and the law at their birth for this people. And unfortunately, the precedent of Aaron is the destiny of this priesthood. It's so interesting to see how all of this comes about, though, and to go on this journey with these people. So here we've had our next steps along our journey, and we've foreshadowed some of what's coming up, which will be a lot of fun to get into. This has been an overview of Lesson 15 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.